Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Clifford Shannon on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I'm very glad to welcome you to this program. We came with this idea for a program to really catch us up on latest in Afghanistan because with everything else that's been in the news, this has perhaps slipped off the front pages. And yet, as we all know so well, so much of the story of 9/11 goes back to Afghanistan itself and with negotiations that hopefully will bring about a peace agreement, but which may bring about the withdrawal of American forces, regardless of whether there's a peace agreement. I think it was very important that we get the expertise that could help us understand where we are right now in relation to Afghanistan. And so I'm particularly pleased to welcome Ambassador Richard Olson, who is now a senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, but had a long distinguished career in the State Department, from which he retired in November of 2016 with the rank of career minister. Many assignments over his career, but a lot of them really did center on the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, and his expertise really developed through a number of really important postings out there. His last assignment, for example, with the State Department was as the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is a job that overlooks the region and particularly the relationship between those two countries. From 2012 to 2015, he was the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan. He also served at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, as the coordinating director for development and economic affairs. So you can see the very extensive experience. Also in the Middle East as well, he worked and he was from 2011 to 2012, the U.S. ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. Apologize, his posting at the UAE was from 2008 to 2011. Those other dates were the coordination job in Kabul. One more point, which I think we'll come to in the course of the conversation, he served as deputy chief of mission at the U.S. mission to NATO in Brussels. So that brings us to the large section of the partnership with our international allies in Afghanistan. And so, Ambassador Olson, welcome. It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for taking the time and doing this program with us.
Thank you, Clifford. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Looking forward to our conversation.
Well, let's start. We were talking beforehand, and we will get to Afghanistan through this first conversation, but you were the Consul General in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates on 9/11, and you may have had some contact with the South Asian world before that, but it was in that context that, you were first, in terms of the American war effort, brought to contact with Afghanistan. But tell me what it was like to be in the Middle East, to be in an Arab Muslim country, when 9/11 hit, your own reaction, being an American representative abroad, and the reaction of the society around you to what had happened in the United States.
Yes, it was a fascinating period. I had actually arrived on August 11th, so precisely 1 month before in Dubai. So I was really just beginning to get myself established in my new posting. Although I'd been in Abu Dhabi for the previous 2 years. Just down the road, the capital of the UAE. So I had some understanding of the UAE perspective. And like a lot of people, of course, 9/11 for me was an episode that I saw on television. I saw it in the evening. I'd come home from work. It was about, if I recall, about 5 o'clock in the evening, and we were having over some friends for drinks. And we saw the first strike, and like everyone kind of wondered what had happened, and then saw the second strike. And we all knew immediately what this was, because anybody who had been watching the intelligence over that summer knew that, as has been repeatedly reported, that the system was blinking red, and Al Qaeda was clearly planning something. So we knew right. I knew right away what this was, even before all of the details came out. The immediate reaction, of course. And my immediate job was to make sure that the American community was okay. We had a substantial American community in Dubai, And Dubai is a very tranquil, safe place. No one ever worries about security, but naturally the community was apprehensive. And so I had to do a lot of work to reassure them that, in fact, the government of the UAE was still protecting them and very adequately. I mean, there was never any security. There was one or two security incidents in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, but they were relatively minor. But then diplomatically, the challenge was that the UAE was one of the few countries that had recognized the Taliban regime, along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And that had been a focus of our diplomacy before 9/11, but it became very intense afterwards. And you'll recall that President Bush came out with the famous "you're with us or you're against us" statement. And it was my job to deliver that message to the then Crown Prince of Dubai, Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who is now the ruler of Dubai. And so I think it was a week or so after 9/11. He was actually in the United States on 9/11. That's another story. But after he came back, I met with him. And during the course of that meeting, he very clearly professed that he wanted to be on the side with the U.S. and was outraged by the attack and wanted to assure us he was a supporter. And what he did was he said that he had a ranch in southern Afghanistan. This is, by the way, a ranch that figures sort of in Steve Cole's book, Ghost Warriors. He said, if you ever have use for this piece of property, you're welcome to it. And I happen to know that you can land a C-130 on it because I haven't seen he would go falcon hunting there. And so he said, and so I know you can land a C-130 on the improved landing strip we have there. So I conveyed this back through channels. And in fact, the Marines landed at that facility I think it was in November of 2001 under General Mattis, then Brigadier General Mattis, and they called it Camp Rhino, and that's the origins of our little foothold in Kandahar.
So it was the private estate of the then the Crown Prince.
Yes, that's correct.
Well, I guess if it's convenient to have your own C-130 to be able to give a report on whether or not the landing strip is sufficient for the occasion. Fast forward, I mean, back in those days, it seemed certainly from the American side that this was something that could be done relatively quickly, that this was something that, the military challenge of the terrain and of the tribal relationships was understood, but really in terms of the balance of forces and the relative weight of power, it certainly seemed like this would be something the Americans could manage. And yet here we are 20 years later, and we're still there, and we have not resolved the fundamental issue of who is going to control Afghanistan and whether that control will continue to permit or re-permit threats to the United States. I mean, how do you see that 20-year trajectory? What does it look like to you, the accomplishments and the setbacks that we've faced coming to this point where there really is no clear end in sight? Well,
I would say a couple of things. First of all, in terms of the overall trajectory, I think we did have a big impact on Afghan society. I mean, if you look at the development that has taken place since 2001, it's quite significant. I mean, Afghans are now much more connected to the outside world. They have access to healthcare. They have access to education in ways they really did not have prior to 2001. But it's still one of the poorest countries in the world, and there's nothing that could have been done to change that basic dynamic. In terms of the sort of political and military trajectory, I do think, unfortunately, there were some missed opportunities. I think but I think they were very early on. I think the critical period was 2002, 2003, when, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, we see that had we been more focused on a political settlement at that point, that is to say, if we had brought in the Taliban in those days and started a discussion with them, we probably could have accomplished what we would love to have now, which is to have had a de facto Taliban surrender, or at least a very concessionary peace. But unfortunately, the reality was that the United States was at that point gearing up for the war with Iraq. And I think that that was read by not only the Afghans, but more importantly by the Pakistanis as signaling a lack of commitment on the part of the United States to seeing through what needed to be done in Afghanistan. So I think that was a real missed opportunity. But I think that having said that, I think there has been a consensus that has emerged over the course of the past 2 decades that we do have to pursue a political settlement. And I would say, bringing it forward, there's a lot of history here that we could spend, all of the session talking about what's happened in the previous 20 years. But to bring it up to the present, this administration has actually been committed to a political settlement with the appointment of Ambassador Khalilzad. There has been significant progress on getting negotiating tracks going. I mean, there are 2 negotiating tracks now that are active. One is the U.S. Taliban track, which resulted in the Doha Agreement in February, which I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about. And the other is the ongoing Afghan peace negotiations, in which the Afghan Republic is talking to the Taliban. This is going to be a long, drawn-out process, and there has already been considerable, ups and downs in the process. But it does suggest that there is a way to arrive at a political settlement over time that will allow for the U.S. withdrawal of forces, but also with some hope of preserving the gains that have been made over the past 20 years.
One of the interesting things you point out is, the distinction between an ideological conflict and a political conflict. And, negotiating politics seems anyway to be easier than negotiating ideology. That early point you talk about where things might have been different was also a point at which, as you characterized it earlier, the "you're for us or against us" sort of captures the nature of what an ideological dispute is. It doesn't really allow for shades of gray and compromise. And I think it's also fair to say, though, that still underlies the situation today, given what the Taliban's commitments are, given what our commitments are, that while the balance certainly has shifted towards looking for a political settlement, that political settlement seems to be stymied as it emerges, or possibilities emerge, by these deep ideological divides that not only separate us from the Taliban, but separate the Afghans among themselves.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things that have to be distinguished here. First of all, really the dispute that the United States had with the Taliban, even in 2001, was not fundamentally with their ideology. I don't think any American is sympathetic to the Taliban ideology. But the reason that we invaded Afghanistan on October 7th of 2001 was because the Taliban regime, refused to hand over Osama bin Laden and the leadership of Al-Qaeda. And the real cause of the conflict in Afghanistan, or our conflict with the Taliban, was their willingness to host Al-Qaeda. So it was never really about us going to war with the Taliban because of their ideology. And I think that same dynamic has been true even with the U.S.-Taliban agreement that we reached in Doha in February. This was a very pragmatic decision, pragmatic policy, if you will. It essentially called for the phased conditional withdrawal of U.S. forces in return for a Taliban commitment to not allow Al-Qaeda to use its territory for attacks on the United States. That's the core of the Doha Agreement. There are, of course, some other important interrelated pieces to it, and we can talk about those. But at its essence, it's not really a conflict of values between the United States and the Taliban, even though, as I say, very few Americans would in any way countenance, the Taliban's worldview. That's not the case for the intra-Afghan negotiations, for the Afghan peace negotiations. For the Afghans, and that is to say the Republic negotiating with the Taliban, these are the core issues, and they're going to be very, very, very hard. And you're absolutely right that the Taliban has a theocratic view of the world, and it is difficult for them to come to the level of what we would consider practical politics and bargaining, because they really do sort of insist on ideological purity. And unfortunately, they read the past 20 years as having left them in a militarily superior, victorious position, which is probably not true, but that's how they are coming at these negotiations. So those negotiations are going to be, I predict, difficult and prolonged.
Let's talk about those negotiations, because, the negotiation between the U.S. and the Taliban, which took its own time and had many hurdles along the way, was not a negotiation that included the Afghan government, which obviously would be deeply concerned by what the United States and the Taliban would agree to. Subsequent negotiations between, as you say, the Taliban and the Afghan Republic are underway, but very slow and difficult process. In separating those two types of discussions, I want to read you something. Tony Cordesman has been writing about these things for quite a long time, describes the logic of the negotiation process as follows. He says, from the start, the Afghan peace process seems to have been at least as much a cover for American withdrawal as an effort to achieve a real peace. While the U.S. never stated that withdrawal was its primary goal, its February agreement did virtually nothing to define what a peace with the Taliban could or should be. It placed far more emphasis on full withdrawal in 14 months than it did on creating the conditions for successful peace negotiations. So it seems clear that the purposes that the U.S. has and that the Afghan government have are not identical in relation to what the outcome of this is going to be. Do you think that's a fair characterization, that distance between us and our putative allies in the Afghan government?
No, I really don't. I think we have to take a step back here and look at the history of the negotiations over the long term. I mean, the United States had a policy of seeking reconciliation, as we used to call it, with the Taliban since at least 2011. It was one of the central planks of the Obama administration's Afghan policy. But the policy at that time was that it had to be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned process. And the problem with that, the challenge was that the Taliban absolutely refused to recognize the republic, the government in Kabul, and would not sit down and negotiate with them. So their position was that they would negotiate with the U.S. first and arrange for the withdrawal of U.S. forces. And once foreign forces were withdrawn, or there was a commitment to withdrawal, then they would negotiate with the Republic. So a number of us tried, I was one of them, tried very hard to negotiate. I actually did do some back channel negotiations with the Taliban, trying to get them to get a peace process started. And it always failed on this fundamental point. So Ambassador Khalilzad's, I think, very elegant solution to this dilemma was to break the withdrawal into two pieces. There was sort of a down payment of a partial withdrawal that took place in May of this year. It was called for in the Doha Agreement, but that the final agreement, the final drawdown, would not take place until May of next year. And during that, nearly 18-month period, the idea was that there was a requirement for the Taliban to come to the table with the Afghan government and begin talking in dialogue with the Afghan Republic. Now, unfortunately, and this is where the real world intercedes, that whole process has been delayed. Those talks, the Afghan peace talks, were supposed to begin on March 10th. In fact, they didn't get going till September. And then they really have only just arrived at a procedural understanding just in the last few weeks. And I think, frankly, I mean, candidly, I think they're now taking a little break, but I think that's really waiting to get a signal for what the Biden administration will do with regard to the peace process. But the whole process has been delayed. But the initial idea that Ambassador Khalilzad had was there would be 18 months of negotiations that would allow at least the beginning of the outline of a political settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban before a complete withdrawal. So, the upshot of all this is that the Biden administration, when it comes in, is going to be faced with a challenge right away about what they do about the May 2021 deadline. And I think that's going to be a big question for them. They will face some decisions, I think, right away about what to do about Afghanistan.
So we come to the question of troops and troop levels in Afghanistan. There are currently, I believe, under 12,000 troops, which includes just U.S. and NATO and allied forces. And it's important to mention that the U.S. Contingent is less than half of the total foreign force in Afghanistan. This is a NATO operation as much as it is an American operation, and we'll get to that complication later. But the first drawdown as part of the agreement with the Taliban has now come up again in terms of President Trump's initial declaration that all troops should be out by the end of the year, which certainly runs counter to the logic of the negotiations. But now the decision has been apparently to cut the American contingent from 4,500 to 2,500 by the middle of January. And that's the gift that's going to be passed along to the Biden administration. So, obviously these are mixed signals. If the US were to withdraw unilaterally, the Taliban wouldn't really have to do anything but watch. Put aside the question of what that does for our NATO allies, we'll come to that. But with 2,500 troops and this unilateral announcement that this is what's going to happen, what is the impact that you see both in the country, on the stability of the situation there, and then, of course, on the negotiations? The end of the Trump administration means that if 2,500 folks are there still in January, it won't be President Trump who decides what happens next. But even bringing them down to that level, is that a risk to the stability and to the logic of negotiations by itself?
Well, as I said, I think that Ambassador Khalilzad had a scheme when he laid this all out, and you are absolutely correct that it has gone differently, I think, from how the original structure of the deal was to work. And I think that these drawdowns have probably weakened the negotiating position of the government. It's important to note that, there was talk. In fact, I think the president tweeted at one point that it was going to be zero in January. And I think that everyone who's looked at this would have said that was really a very bad idea. I mean, that would have almost certainly could have well provoked the collapse of the Afghan government. The republic certainly would have triggered an intensified civil war. So at least it's not the worst case scenario. My own view is that there will continue to be some degree of U.S. leverage as long as there's any troop presence. But I do think, and I'm not the person, I'm obviously not a military guy. I can't speak to the military efficiency of a force of 2,500. And I don't know what they can do or not do, really. But as it impacts the negotiations, it still leaves us with a certain amount of leverage. And there is, of course, the entire question of going out with our allies, which we'll address separately, which I think is important. So in the end, I think it's less than ideal, but I don't think it totally undoes leverage. And the final point is, the Biden administration, I think, if they wanted to, I think they would be able to. If they decided that the appropriate troop level was 5,000, I think they could probably do it without the expenditure of too much political capital. I mean, troop levels have gone up and down over the past few years, and there was bipartisan criticism of the president for going down to 2,500. There was probably also bipartisan support for going down to 2,500. So I don't think it's necessarily a done deal that the Biden administration has no options in this regard.
Let me ask, though, you raised the possibility of certainly civil war if the U.S. were to withdraw, but the collapse of the Afghan government possibly. Are we the prop that holds it up? I mean, is there domestic support for this to the degree that it would still exist? Let's not talk about the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops, but what is the role of U.S. forces there? And I don't mean for you to give the military assessment, but in terms of what they mean for the direction of the country. Clearly, they're a bulwark against the Taliban being able to do much more than they're currently doing. But are they essential to maintaining an opposition, a concerted, centralized opposition to the Taliban through the government in Kabul?
Well, I would disassociate this question, U.S. support. I would distinguish between U.S. support and U.S. troops. Okay, and I think that's a real fundamental point here. Because I think what's actually quite important at this point to the Afghan government is U.S. financial support, that is to say, civilian assistance, but which largely keeps the Afghan government running. I mean, it's mostly flows through multilateral institutions, but it actually does provide the sort of the substitute for the revenue that's necessary to keep the Afghan government running, and also the support for the armed forces. That is to say, the financial support. I'm not talking about troops on the ground. So I think the Afghan government has actually made this point that they feel that they can survive as long as the U.S. and the international community continue to fund the Afghan government and fund the Afghan security forces. So you can envision a scenario in which the U.S. actually goes down to zero, but still maintains its support for the government while negotiations go on, and that is a scenario that is more or less stable. I mean, the bulk of the fighting and the dying these days is absolutely done by the Afghan forces. The one sort of caveat on all of this is probably U.S. air power would continue to be important, and there would probably be some need for some, residual U.S. ability to conduct airstrikes if the Taliban actually mass to try to take a big city, because they haven't been able to do that up until now because of precisely, the superiority of American air power.
I wonder, let's come to the impact of the NATO forces as well. I'm going to quote from a speech by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who said NATO could pay a heavy price for leaving Afghanistan early. We now face a difficult decision. We've been in Afghanistan for almost 20 years, and no NATO ally wants to stay any longer than necessary. But at the same time, the price for leaving too soon in an uncoordinated way could be very high. Afghanistan risks becoming once again a platform for international terrorists, and ISIS could rebuild in Afghanistan the terror caliphate it lost in Syria and Iraq. And one more point here, which is really this extraordinary warning from the NATO Secretary General to what I understand to be the United States and the Trump administration. He says, we went into Afghanistan together, and when the time is right, we should leave together in a coordinated and orderly way. I count on all NATO allies, and I read that as the United States, to live up to this commitment, which is really, an extraordinary thing for NATO having to remind the United States about why everybody's there and what this all goes back to.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I completely agree with your analysis of Stoltenberg's speech, and I think this was very much directed at us. And as you noted also earlier, there are, for the first time, there are more European troops on the ground in Afghanistan than American troops. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's now about double the number of European troops as compared to Americans with the latest drawdowns. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the allies, our European allies, are in some ways more directly threatened by Afghanistan than we are, just because they're geographically closer. So that works to the advantage of the terrorists. And in some ways, their societies, or maybe, their airports are a little more open than ours are. Ours, since post 9/11, we've invested a lot in homeland security, and European countries are probably a little more open because their economies are more dependent on that. In addition, they are much more vulnerable to migration. During the Great Migration Crisis of 2015, one of the things that didn't really get reported was that how many of those people were Afghans, many of them not coming from Afghanistan, but coming from other countries that sort of used the opportunity to, push out a few people. But there's almost no doubt that if Afghanistan went into a civil war, that there would be huge migration flows, mostly bound for Europe. So they have their own interests in what they're doing. But even more than that, what Stoltenberg was really getting at is that the remaining European forces are almost entirely dependent on U.S. logistical support, including for exiting. So one of the real dangers of the idea of going to zero by January was that would have meant abandoning our European allies. And that would have led to some very ugly scenes. I mean, that might have been, sort of Saigon 1975, people clutching at the helicopters trying to get out. And it would have included our European allies. So, and on that note, one of the other deadlines that the Biden administration is going to face is that in February, there is a NATO defense ministerial. And the European allies will be expecting, I think, a very clear signal from this administration as to whether or not the U.S. is going to go to zero by May of 2021 in accordance with the Doha Agreement, or whether, we intend to stay longer, and I think on that point, I think that there is a number of us feel there's a possibility that some kind of delay could be negotiated with the Taliban, but that means you have to negotiate with the Taliban, and that means you have to do that pretty quickly.
Now, these agreements with the Taliban are contingent on basically a truce, that the violence and the military activities are not continuous, and that the conditions would allow for the troop withdrawal. But that really hasn't been the case on the ground. There still have been Taliban offensives or manifestations of violence, certainly attacks within cities, not massing to take cities. So have the Taliban, in your view, upheld that part of the agreement that would then at least provide the opportunity for the United States to consider their withdrawal?
Well, the Taliban would argue, and I'm not going to defend the Taliban, but their argument would be that they have lived up to the terms of the Doha Agreement because they have not been attacking Americans and foreign forces. They have not been attacking NATO. They have been attacking Afghan targets. And in fact, their rhetoric has been extremely unhelpful because they have, recently said that they consider that their jihad will continue not just until foreign forces are done, but until they have eliminated all foreign influences in Afghanistan, including, as they see it, the current republic. So that's really a problem. But I think there's no question that front and center for the Afghan government side, the republic, there's a demand for a ceasefire. And I think personally, the United States should put its full diplomatic weight behind that. I think it has under Ambassador Khalilzad, but I think that will be an important element for a new administration to argue for credible reduction in violence and ceasefire, if possible. I think in the end, the Taliban will not agree to a full ceasefire until they actually have a political settlement. but I think there needs to be a reduction of violence in order to create the atmosphere for positive discussions. The irony in all of this is that the Taliban have military strength, but they don't have a lot of political strength. I mean, all of the polling for Afghanistan consistently over many years shows that the Taliban enjoy support amongst a small minority of the population. So the trick in these negotiations is to mobilize the latent political strength on the Republic side against the Taliban's military strength. Very, very difficult to do, but I think that's the challenge for the negotiations ahead.
You know, it's interesting. We go back to this and we talked about the origins of the war, and this comes to a question that Sergio wanted to ask. I mean, we are there initially as part of a counterterrorism strategy, and for the obvious reason that this is where 9/11 originated. I mean, the point you make about the Taliban's rhetoric does sort of come back to the earlier point I was trying to make about ideology seeping through all of this. But, you know, is there a scenario in your mind where rather than trying to find a way out, and obviously if we could find a secure way out, we would, but is there another scenario where we simply come to the realization that we are going to need to maintain for the foreseeable future, however long that is, some sort of presence and support, whether it's military and or economic, political, for an Afghan government that opposes the Taliban simply because the counterterrorism mission remains central to what we're doing there. And we simply can't trust the Taliban if they were to become ascendant again in that country. We can't trust them to maintain distance from Al-Qaeda and the international threats that would perhaps naturally emerge from their maintaining power.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's really the core of the question here. I think that it is possible that the United States could maintain a modest counterterrorism force in Afghanistan, and the associated costs of maintaining the Afghan armed forces and a functioning government. I think that's affordable, but there are a couple of things that have to be considered. First of all, it would mean breaking the peace process with the Taliban. So that means we go back to war with the Taliban. So it's probably not, 2,500 or 4,500 troops. I mean, I'm not a military guy, but I'm thinking it's probably more like 15 to 20,000 troops. And they're going to be fighting and they're going to be taking casualties. So ultimately, this is a question that the American people have to answer. What is their appetite for this? And what costs are we prepared to say? Some people talk about, analogies with Germany and Korea and Japan after the Second World War. Yeah, fine, but no one was shooting at our soldiers in Germany and Korea after 1953 and Japan after 1945. That was garrison duty. It's kind of a different deal here. So there's that question. There's also a broader geostrategic question, which is people don't realize this, of course, but some people don't realize it, that Afghanistan is a landlocked country. You have to fly through some other country to get into Afghanistan. You have to fly through somebody's airspace. That somebody is Pakistan. So we have been locked in a dysfunctional relationship with Pakistan for 20 years because of our war in Afghanistan, in which fundamentally we and the Pakistanis have been pursuing separate objectives. And we're now more or less aligned because of the peace process. But if we were to break the peace process, we would become once again disaligned with Pakistanis, and they would have some leverage over us. So that's something that can
just come in right there, because we've talked about the Pakistani interest in Afghanistan and other programs, but I would love to get your description of the disjunction between American and Pakistani interests and policies in Afghanistan. What are the Pakistanis up to? And putting the question of negotiations aside, what do they want as an outcome there that is different from what we want?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is a very mysterious area, right? And even the best informed people, and I spent 3 years of my life in Pakistan trying to answer that question, and I'm not sure I arrived at any definitive conclusions. because of the intense compartmentalization of the Pakistani state and the discrepancy between the publicly stated policy, which is enunciated by civilians, and then the actual policy that is carried out by not just the military, but by the intelligence elements of the Pakistani military in a completely deniable way. And I think, as far as I can tell, they have certainly strategically wanted, but that has to be balanced. They have supported the Taliban, and I think they want a peace process in which the Taliban comes into the Afghan government and has some role in the Afghan government, but is not necessarily the dominant force. And the other thing is, I think they do want to maintain a relationship with the United States at the end of the day, and that is what has prevented them throughout this period from going, all in and absolutely supporting the Taliban in a way that inevitably would have increased the chances of conflict with us. So for them, it has been a balancing act. You can call it duplicity if you want, but that has been, the overall situation. But right now, since probably 2018, since the appointment of Ambassador Khalilzad, and the reinvigoration of the peace process, I think we have been actually quite strategically aligned with Pakistan. Pakistan sees this as the U.S. in some ways coming around to what they have argued for all along, which is a political settlement to the conflict in Afghanistan.
You spent time, it's a few years ago, granted, but that dichotomy in terms of where power lies in Pakistan and what is public and what is private, well, that must have just bedeviled any effort to sort of find your way to understanding what was going on in that country and how to weigh what you were hearing from, I assume, the highest levels of the civilian government as against what you were hearing from military and intelligence sources. It's got to be just very, very frustrating at some level.
Well, look, in Pakistan, I never had a day where I didn't feel I'd earned my pay. I hadn't earned my pay, So yeah, absolutely, it's a challenging environment. In some ways, it's also, for a diplomat, it's a fascinating place to be, and I have to say that I had, tremendous access, and this was not a question of being shut out or not talking. It was just sort of divining the difficulty, getting through the difficulties of the compartmentalization of the Pakistani state.
Let me come back to the NATO question, because you may have some thoughts on, the possibility that the United States would just sort of unilaterally pull out and leave its allies behind. It's even shocking to contemplate, because after all, NATO is there and invoked Article 5 as the self-defense clause of the treaty because of 9/11, because of what happened to us. And so even that this should be a concern seems absurd. And yet President Trump has been critical of NATO, extremely so. It's not clear that he really believed the United States should be involved with NATO over the long term. And so, we can expand the conversation a little bit based on this sort of threat, implicit or not, to the NATO presence in Afghanistan, to the bigger question of the U.S. relationship with NATO, which in the last 4 years has become much more complicated than it previously had been. So I guess my question to you is, shifting gears a little bit, where do you see that relationship? Is the kind of tension that we see in Afghanistan emblematic of what's happened over the last 4 years? And can that breach be closed, if not entirely healed?
Well, I'm reasonably confident, on the sort of narrow question of Afghanistan, that the NATO equities are extremely well understood by the senior leadership of our government, and especially our senior military leadership. And as long as they have any say in these processes, and I think they do, I think at the end of the day, that's why we haven't gone to zero. I think we can be assured that we will, at a minimum, go out together as NATO, if that's what we if that's what's decided. Perhaps I'm naive, but I really think that that's likely to happen. If it didn't happen, if we did abandon our allies in NATO, I think it's difficult to overestimate the damage that would do to the alliance. I think at a minimum, it would mean that the alliance would absolutely not consider out of area operations at a time when we are trying to convince the alliance, to be thinking about China, which is so far outside of Europe. I mean, it's actually amazing that we can even get China into NATO documents. So that's the first part of it. In terms of overall relations with NATO, I do think we have to distinguish a bit between tone and substance when it comes to NATO. The tone under this administration has been quite striking. And I would say, for instance, the raising of the funding question, the fact that NATO allies are not all funding their defense forces at 2% of GDP, are not meeting the benchmark, has become, under this administration, sort of the central issue with regard to NATO. It was always an issue. I mean, I remember when I was at NATO watching George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, Secretary Gates, Bob Gates, delivering a very stern tongue lashing to allies around the table in Brussels about precisely this issue. But under this administration, it has gone very public, and it has been defined almost as the top issue. That's all a question of tone, and that can somewhat be repaired. But where I think damage may have been done is that this administration also linked it to Article 5. And that has been something that no administration has ever done before. And in fact, every administration since the creation of NATO has been at great pains to reassure the Europeans that we were serious about NATO, Article 5. The Europeans have had their doubts as to whether during the Cold War, the United States would in fact risk nuclear annihilation for the sake of keeping West Berlin free. And those anxieties on European parts tended to increase during periods of retrenchment of U.S. foreign policy, which was one of the reasons that after the debacle in Vietnam, the Nixon and then Ford administrations actually focused very heavily on Europe and reinforcing NATO to cauterize the wound of Vietnam. But I think there's going to be some work that needs to be done on this fundamental question of Article 5, because I think having raised this in the context of the funding debate, it will be difficult for the U.S. to simply paper it over with rhetorical flourishes. I think it'll be necessary to actually demonstrate in some sort of concrete ways that we remain committed to the principle of Article 5.
Principle of Article 5 being the mutual
defense,
which initially was always intended to be the Americans going to Europe, the Europeans from the Russians, but obviously things evolved in a different direction. It raises, though, the larger question, and as a diplomat, you would have to deal with this in future postings. The degree to which the break that the Trump administration represented in what were traditional American policies, whether it's in NATO, whether in relation to alliances and tariffs, all of these things, a new administration comes in and says, well, we're not going to do that anymore. But the damage has been done in the sense that, well, somebody said, we had heard previously you weren't going to do this anymore, and yet somebody had come in and done it. And so how do you make up for that? What is the nature of the damage that lingers even if a new administration comes in and changes some of the policies that gave immediate cause for concern?
Well, I think that the test will come, in various foreign policy crises. I mean, I think it will come when there is a crisis, and allies will be looking to see how we react to it, how robustly we react, and that may be, something with Russia, something in Ukraine. It may be, although the likelihood actually now is that it will take place in a non-traditional domain of military activity, albeit probably a cyber attack or something like that. So I think that's the first point. The broader point that I think I would make, though, is that, again, we need to separate out sort of questions of tone and substance. I have no doubt that the new administration will have a very different tone towards allies than has been the case for the past 4 years. But the challenge of the election in 2016, I think, is in part a signal, I think, from the American people that some of the arrangements that we have taken for granted over the past 70 plus years, we set up everything after the Second World War when we controlled 50% of world GDP. We now, at least by purchasing power parity, control about 15 to 16%. And I think there are some very real questions on the part of the American people about whether, we can still afford to pay the same price for American leadership that we were prepared to pay. It's hard to imagine any president in his inaugural address, his or her, repeating John F. Kennedy's lines, "We'll pay any price for freedom." I don't think the American people are there. So I think there are some questions that still need to be addressed that are more than just tone, that are actually about substance and what kind of leadership we want and can afford.
You come back to the Kennedy speech about paying any price for freedom, and I want to revert to something you talked about at the beginning in relation to Afghanistan, which was, the real accomplishments in the transformation of that society, whether education more generally, education for girls in particular, the status of minorities being transformed, just greater freedoms in daily life for Afghans who want them. These were actually important selling points initially in relation to the war in Afghanistan, what we had accomplished there. And yet these are intangible in some way in terms of the daily life of Americans. They go to American leadership and what we think our values are and how we can defend those values elsewhere. And I think it was Secretary Clinton who actually wanted and made women's rights into one of the pillars of American foreign policy during her time as Secretary of State. So, there are sort of symbolic values questions which rise very, very high. And yet, I would imagine that, in the event of a destabilization of things in Afghanistan, the return, even in some sort of balance of power, the Taliban gaining strength, these things are put at risk, and Americans may well have to at least accept that they are reduced or sacrificed in some way under these new arrangements.
Yeah, well, I think there are going to be some very difficult prices that are going to have to be paid by in order to bring about a political settlement. I think the critical thing here is that, and let's be clear that the principal price is going to be paid by Afghans, much more than it is going to be paid by Americans. We've paid a significant price over the past 20 years, but the price of an actual peace settlement will have to be borne by the Afghan people. And that's why I think it is really important that we continue to support this peace process. Maybe we need to put our thumb a little more on the side of the Republic side rather than the Taliban, and make clear what are that the values that we support are important. One of the points of leverage that we have with the Taliban is that they want international acceptance and they want international assistance. They understand as well, not as well, but they somewhat grasp that their government is not going to function unless they have some level of foreign assistance. And the international community, especially the Europeans, have made very clear that there will be no foreign assistance if it's back to the 90s in terms of how Afghan women are treated. So I think all of this is messy, but it has to be seen against the backdrop of an incredibly brutal conflict that has gone on in Afghanistan for 40 years. Okay, our war has lasted 20 years. The Afghan war has lasted 40 years, almost continuously. So there is an enormous price that is being paid on a daily basis by the Afghan people. And for them, they're going to have to weigh the price of peace against the price of an ongoing bloody conflict. But they're the only ones who can make those kinds of decisions, not us.
Yeah. Let me, we got a couple of questions about the United Arab Emirates as we're closing. We take you back to your ambassadorship there. And the UAE has taken on a much more aggressive role in the world, both militarily, culturally. I mean, they clearly are trying to project something, culminating most recently in a peace agreement with Israel, which I would imagine in your time there would have been unthinkable. What do you think of where they are going? Why are they doing this? How do you assess the peace agreement with Israel? Is it actually rooted in something that would make it more durable than the seeming cold peaces with the Israelis have with the Egyptians and the Jordanians?
First of all, it wasn't unthinkable. I thought it. I mean, I don't want to claim any credit for this. I had nothing to do with it. But it was always clear that from my conversations with very senior Emiratis that they saw a degree of strategic alignment with Israel because both Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, see their fundamental threat as coming from Iran. And I think that's kind of the core concern that has driven this. And it is also, they realized also, the Emiratis, I think, that making peace with Israel not only would be helpful on its own terms, it has economic benefits, clearly. I mean, Israel is doing phenomenally well in terms of startups and innovative industries. But they also realized that having a peace treaty with Israel would also facilitate what has always been a little bit of a challenge for them, which is getting the best U.S. military equipment that they can use in what they see as a potential confrontation, or really a deterrent against Iranian aggression. So I think the important piece about the Peace of Abraham is the geopolitical realities that underlie it, the threat from Iran, the fact that out of this, the UAE will get the F-35 fighters. But I do think that they're going to, the Emiratis will make an effort to have this be a warm peace, because they understand the importance of the sort of soft side of diplomacy and the role of soft power in the calculations of other countries. They have a number of American institutions established in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, and they realize that gives them a bond with the American people that ultimately works to their advantage when it comes to security and Congress and all sorts of things. And so I think it'll be a warmer peace between UAE and Israel than it has been with Egypt. Although I do think it's fair to say that I think that I'm not sure the majority of Emiratis are, it's going to take a little while for them to get used to this idea of being at peace with Israel. Let's put it that way.
Well, I will say we have jumped around to a lot of your postings, a lot of places where you represented our country, and we want to thank you for that. And just, the remarkable degree to which you can bring the perceptions of what the U.S. is abroad and what these different countries think of the U.S. and how we interact with them. Thank you so much for taking the time and doing this. I want to just remind everybody, I've been speaking with Richard Olson, now Senior Advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, but a long distinguished career at the State Department. Rick, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, Clifford, thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Very interesting discussion. Great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And let me thank our audience again for joining. We will be back with you after the holidays. Thank you for staying with us. Stay safe and be well. Happy New Year. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.